Joining us now in the Element Well studios, Forrest Thigpen, Senior Advisor with Empower Mississippi. Good to see you, Forrest.
Good to see you, Gerard.
All right, so wanted to start out by talking about an article that you published a few days ago about criminal justice reform. And my key takeaway from the article, Forrest, was that you were trying to maybe debunk some of the misconceptions about criminal justice reform, and in particular prison reform, in terms of its impact on crime itself.
Yeah.
Tell us about that.
Well, there's no question that crime has been on the increase in the last couple of years, and we recognize that, think it's horrible, and think that there are some people who need to be in prison. But I just wanted to correct some of the misconceptions that have been floating around, especially in light of the parole board's action recently on a specific decision that they made that I know you've talked about.
Yep.
And a lot of other people have, appropriately. But the reforms that were passed in Mississippi, the big ones were in 2014 and 2021. The spike in crime started in 2020, so it doesn't correspond. It is continued, but it doesn't correspond to either of those reforms. And the purpose of those reforms was to recognize that there are a lot of people in prison who don't really need to be in prison, and basically we're spending a lot of money housing people and feeding them and keeping them from being productive citizens if they would be. And an indication of that is last year, 2021, the admissions to our prisons in Mississippi, it was 83% or 73%, I think, of the admissions were for drug offenses or nonviolent crimes. And so if we're spending our time and our resources on nonviolent crimes and drug crimes, and actually a majority of those drug crimes were for mere possession of drugs. If we're spending all of our prosecutorial time, police time, prison space, the cost that goes with all of that, if that's where we're spending our time, then we're not spending our time focusing on the violent crime that actually harms people. Okay.
Do we have any statistics on that? Like of the number incarcerated in Mississippi, how many are in for an extended period of time, for sure, that really didn't harm anyone, didn't commit a violent crime, and did not, I guess, take anybody's stuff. It's one simple way to put it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, taking
Just
stuff
possession.
taking stuff is a property crime.
Right.
And actually that has been on the decline for 20 years.
Okay.
And continued to decline even over the last few years as violent crime has increased. Okay. Which is a fascinating thing.
That is interesting, yeah.
But yes, there are statistics on that, and you mentioned that I'm senior advisor, and that's because I'm old. And at this particular moment, I'm not remembering the exact statistic that it is, but it is a significant portion of our prison population is drug or nonviolent crimes. And as I said, last year, the vast majority of admissions were for drug or nonviolent crimes.
Talking about drug possession or sale of drugs, distribution of drugs?
Drugs of all sorts, but a majority of those drug convictions of people who went to prison for drug offenses, more than half of those were just for possession.
Interesting. So they get locked up. We pay for that. They just were possessing an illegal drug.
Right.
That was the crime they committed.
Yeah.
Costs money. So what do the folks that run the Department of Corrections, what do they say about it? And of course, you got law enforcement as well. I know they have very strong feelings about this. That usually where there's some issues, right?
That's right. And see, one of the problems in all of this is that we tend to live, especially in the age of social media, we tend to live in an all or nothing mentality.
Yeah, I agree.
Either you're all good or you're all bad. Either you should go away forever or or you shouldn't go at all.
Yeah.
You know, it's all your fault or it's none of your fault.
Yeah.
And so we slide into those ruts where we then just take on whatever the natural thing is. If we think that people ought to go to prison forever, then we fall into that tough on crime mode, which is exactly where I was. I would still say I still am. In the 90s, I was one of the proponents of the 3 strikes and you're out and other harsh penalties because the research showed then, and still does now, this is the key, it still does now show that there are people, a relatively few number of people who should be locked up, and some of those should be locked up for life.
Okay.
Because a vast majority of the crimes are committed by a relatively few number of people, a relatively small number of people.
Yeah.
And so if you focus, this is going to be one of our recommendations in a report we'll have coming out soon. If you focus on, if you do what's called focused deterrence, and that's when you go into neighborhoods where there is a lot of crime, and the police first of all need to be adequately funded, and we need to make sure that those funds go to hiring and training competent officers and not to equip a bunch of equipment that looks fancy but they don't necessarily need. So that's the first thing, is equip the police with the personnel and the training that they need. And then part of that is to go into neighborhoods, find out who the acts from the neighbors, because they know who the criminals are, and then go to those criminals. This has worked in a number of cities, conservative and liberal led, and say, if you continue, then we will arrest you quickly. And that's what apparently is what criminals respond to more than a length of a sentence or a fear of being in prison for a long time. The greater deterrent is the swift and certain, is to know that they will be arrested and it will happen quickly. It won't be dragged out over years.
I got you. So I got a comment here on the C Spire text line. Bradford in Blue Springs says sometimes they're arrested for possessing drugs, but originally they were arrested for aggravated assault, but that charge was dropped due to a plea bargain, and that kind of causes a
that is true.
Situation.
Yeah, and we don't know how many of those that are for possession were pled from a stronger, whether it's even a stronger drug charge or something like that. That does happen, and so we don't know exactly how often that happens.
Okay.
But that's a valid point.
Yeah.
To consider. But again, it's with 70+% of the people going into prison last year going in for drug or nonviolent, and of those drug crimes, half were just for possession, then chances are that's a pretty strong not chances are, that is a pretty strong statement of where we're focusing our attention.
Have you talked to any folks in corrections about this, how they feel about this?
Yeah, and of course they have to deal with what is sent to them.
Sure.
And a lot of this happens in the courts. In fact, I'll say this now: the George, Mr. Bell, who was murdered by another guy named Bell.
Yep.
That for the parole board to parole that man, the guy who committed murder, has zero to do with the law. That was all done by court decisions. So that's another misnomer about the prison reforms that we've worked on, because those prison reforms kept in place what is in the law, that murderers are not eligible for parole.
Yeah, that agree. That is a popular misconception, though.
Right.
And that really has nothing to do with this particular case.
That's right, because the courts have decided that a person with mental illness, if they're rehabilitated, then they're essentially to be treated as if they never committed the crime.
Gotcha.
Which is wrong.
Yeah. We got a break right here. Let's come back. We can talk about some of the test scores that are in nationwide with respect to the impact on our students during the pandemic, who most of which were home and not in school where they should be, and how that looks. We got Forrest Thigpen, Senior Advisor with Empower Mississippi in the Element Wealth Student Forum. Anyhow, Forrest Thigpen with Empower Mississippi is our guest. All right. You had another point you told me you wanted to make about the prison reform efforts.
Yeah, a couple of things. One is I remember hearing a while back the way to think about this is we need to distinguish between who we're mad at and who we're afraid of.
Okay.
So if we're afraid of people because they can harm people, then those are the people that need to be in prison. If we're just mad at them because they did something, whether it's drug crimes or something else, and didn't hurt anybody, if we're just mad at them, then there's a different way to treat them. And even within that, if anybody who has more than one child knows that there are different things that work to affect change in people's lives. I have one friend who in college stole something, and they were just arrested. That's all it took for them for the rest of their lives.
Yeah.
But if they had been convicted and thrown in prison, then that would have been detrimental, not only to their life but to now their families' lives. And so, distinguishing between those is very hard. But it goes back to it's not an all or nothing thing. And another aspect of this, the other point that I want to make, is that the people who get out of prison and commit another crime, so the recidivism rate, those who recidivate, it's in the first 3 years in Mississippi, it's about a third of the people who get out commit another crime. So that means 2/3 don't. Mm-hmm. And of those 1/3 that get out, the majority of those commit those crimes within the first 6 months.
6 months, wow.
And so the story there, and this has been proved by research that has been done all over the country, is that people, when they get out of prison and they're given $25 or $50 and a bus ticket, and that's it, then they just go back to what they knew. They go back to where they were and the situation they came from and the people that they knew. And so it's very important to prepare them for release, to make sure that while they have been in prison, and this new law that passed last year requires them to have what's called a case plan from the time they enter prison till the time of their parole eligibility, which again, this law didn't even guarantee parole. It just it created eligibility for some. But from the time they come in to the time they're eligible for parole, they have this case plan that includes taking different classes, learning a trade, learning some life skills, anger management, drug treatment, which actually works better after they get out. Mm-hmm. But that last 6 months they're in prison and the first 6 months they're out of prison is something that our Department of Corrections is now starting to focus on.
Okay.
So that the people who get out have something different to do than what they came from. And that has been shown to have a dramatic impact on the crime rate.
So on the C Spire text line, somebody wants to hear your thoughts on property crimes, such as a habitual thief. Should they be incarcerated? Property crimes.
Yeah. There are so many different property crimes and so many different circumstances that, like in the case of the person that I mentioned that was in college and stole something, that's different from somebody who has done it multiple times. And so in some cases, yes, they should be in prison.
Yeah.
If they have not just habitual, but certainly if they have the if they continue to do that, then yes, they should be in prison. They shouldn't be in prison for life. That, again, longer sentences doesn't necessarily create a deterrent. But if people show that they are not willing to change, then we have to do something different.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the goal ultimately should be to try to figure out a way for them to re-enter society and be productive and reacclimate. I think there's some situations, though, honestly, it's just not possible.
Yeah, that's right.
You know, I've read lots of reports from the clinical community that says that pedophilia and just child abuse like that, sexual child abuse, just can't be cured.
Yeah.
Just a short circuit in the brain.
Yep. That's right, and that's what I mean is if there are people who have a short circuit in their brain for whatever it is, whether it's a sexual crime or whether it's kleptomania or anything else, then they need to be treated differently. Now, that's another aspect also that has been shown to actually reduce crime is when and that overwhelms our prison system and our jails, the local jails, and our law enforcement officers, is that so many of the people they encounter are doing what they're doing because of a mental illness.
Yeah,
and that can so easily slide into they're not they shouldn't be accountable for that, or they shouldn't be punished for that. And then on the other side, it's it doesn't matter what their situation is; they need to be thrown away in prison. And so there are other ways to deal with that, and that Mississippi has just started to do recently.
Yeah.
Just like what they did with drug courts, they're starting to treat mental illness differently. And really the best way to do that is to have in place where when officers arrest somebody, they can make at least an initial evaluation. They're not equipped to deal with these illnesses, but to have somebody at least on the police staff who can make an initial judgment about, almost like triage, of where they need to go and what type of charge should be made.
Yeah.
Or if not, if they can be treated for a mental illness, then that will reduce crime if they can be treated.
Yeah. I know psychiatrists maintain they can just look at someone's eyes and tell whether or not they're a risk, of violence.
And so officers can be trained to some degree of that, and they can have, especially in the force that has enough people, have somebody trained that can go a little deeper. But that's so much of what our law enforcement deal with every day.
Yeah. And
it discourages them that they can't help more, but it also, they have the responsibility to keep people safe.
Yeah. Let's talk about the test scores. The country didn't really get good news here.
No.
The pandemic really caused historic setbacks, certainly in math in particular, largest decrease ever. Reading down to like early 90s level.
Yeah.
Reading scores dropped. And this is largely thought to be because kids were home and involved in remote learning, which maybe works for some, but overall seems like it doesn't produce as positive and good outcomes as in-person learning.
Yeah, well, and that's a very key point, is that for some it works and for some it doesn't. And so parents need to have the option on what works best for their children.
Sure.
But in terms of the public school scores, which is what this latest report, the National Assessment of Educational Progress.
Public schools only, we should clarify. Because parochial schools did fantastic.
It was mixed too. But the ones that stayed open, including the public schools that stayed open, it appears that they did better. We've got an expert that's looking at the specifics on this, but he said from his initial read, it looks like rural areas did better than urban areas, and states that opened back up more quickly did better than states that stayed closed for a long time.
So what do you think about all this? I mean, what does this instruct from a policy perspective?
Well, it's hard to tell, and that's one of the things about this that is interesting, is that as you saw that the scores, including in Mississippi, went down some, not as bad as the rest of the country.
Yeah.
But you have the grades, the accountability grades that the State Department of Education gave out a few weeks ago, that actually showed a lot of improvement. Both of these are anomalies.
I wondered that as well. Yeah.
These are anomalies because of COVID. And so you shouldn't make long-term policy decisions based on what certainly appears to be an anomaly, and that when things settle back down, they'll have a more accurate view of where we really are.
Somewhat tantamount to my analysis of the deficit. You got the COVID aspect of that and the non-COVID aspect.
Right.
To have a meaningful discussion, we got to get on the level playing field on that.
That's right.
Forrest Thigpen, Senior Policy Advisor of Power Mississippi, has been our guest on Middays. Thanks for coming on, Forrest. Always good to see you.
Good to see you.
We'll take a break right here, coming right back in the Element Wealth